An ideal spa is a place where people find peace, where the space is gentle, scented with lavender, and soft, clean towels are carefully attended to. But here, everything is different. Marjorie, a loyal customer, had just sat down in the comfortable chair when she unexpectedly received a damp towel, musty and heavy with the smell of neglect. She shuddered, her thin hands trembling as she touched the towel, her eyes welling up as the foul odor rose, reminiscent of rotting wood in a damp cellar. She could only whisper, her voice trembling as if on the verge of breaking, "This towel surely hasn't been washed." Cliff, the staff member serving her, quickly responded, as if mocking her, his words brief but full of disdain. "Use it or leave." There was no kindness, no empathy. Marjorie couldn't say anything else, only shaking her head in silence, her eyes vacant, as though everything had collapsed in that moment. A young customer nearby witnessed the scene, silent, unable to believe what was happening. She looked at Marjorie, then around the room, sensing a trust that had been violated. In a corner of the room, John, the spa founder, stood silently, his eyes fixed on the unfolding scene. His heart tightened as he realized the betrayal from the very creation he had painstakingly built. By now, everything had changed. What he had built with love and dedication was now being crushed by irresponsible, indifferent actions. The pain surged in John's heart, but it wasn't just the pain of a boss witnessing failure at work. It was the pain of someone who had built this spa with all their heart, where it had once been a home, a place that welcomed and protected the safety of customers. This spa was not just a business, it was a sacred place, where people came seeking peace. But now before his eyes, it had become a wreck. Not just Marjorie, but many other customers had to endure this poor treatment. Every complaint, every negative review was like a knife stabbing his heart. He wondered if he could save everything, or if this was the end of a beautiful dream. If it were you, what would you do? Stay or leave? These questions kept echoing in John's mind, urging him to act. He couldn't give up. He couldn't let everything end like this. That night, he decided to step into his empire, but this time, not as the boss. He wanted to see the truth, to understand what was happening so that he could change it. This time, I will enter as an invisible man, someone no one knows. The memories of the early days of his business were still vivid in John's mind. He remembered those first mornings when the spa opened. He had kneeled down, cleaning each tile until they shone, sterilizing every tool meticulously, ironing the towels until they were crisp and neatly folded like works of art. Everything was prepared with care for one reason: to make every customer feel safe, comfortable, and respected. He remembered his mother's words, "Cleanliness means safety." That was his guiding principle for everything he did. And so his spa was not just a place for customers to receive beauty treatments. It was a place where they found peace, trust in the hands that cared for them, and complete reassurance. But now what he had created was being destroyed by the careless, irresponsible actions of those he had trusted. The name of this spa, once synonymous with care and safety, had now become a symbol of neglect, of betrayal. John couldn't stand by any longer. He knew that if he did nothing, everything would collapse. But he also understood that to save the spa, he would have to walk a painful, difficult path. With all the determination and heart of a founder, John began his journey to the place he had built, to reclaim the lost values and to find a way to revive it. The next day, John decided not to reveal his identity. He wore a staff uniform, something he hadn't had to use since the opening of the spa. It felt strange. The uniform was baggy, ill-fitting compared to the stylish clothes he usually wore when visiting the spa as the owner. But today, he wasn't the owner. He was just a newcomer, seeking the truth beneath the guise of a nameless employee. The light in the reception area was no longer warm as it once was. The atmosphere was cold, lifeless, and there was nothing to make anyone feel comfortable. John entered, breathing deeply to keep calm. He didn't want to be recognized. Each step was filled with determination, but also fear of what he might witness. He reminded himself to remain silent, to blend in with the shadows of the staff, but deep down he knew he was counting every second, every minute. As soon as he stepped in, John could immediately feel the stark difference between the atmosphere of this spa and the branches he once took so much pride in. At the branch he was most proud of, customers were always warmly welcomed. Staff paid attention to every detail. The sweet scent of lavender, the warm light, the freshly pressed sheets, and meticulously sterilized tools created a wonderful care experience. It was a space where everyone not only came to beautify themselves, but also to experience complete relaxation, like a peaceful retreat. But here, at this branch, the atmosphere was completely different. It was cold, unwelcoming. The staff didn't seem enthusiastic or concerned with their work. The towels were no longer pristine. Instead, there was a disarray in the laundry. Hair cutting tools were left carelessly, showing no signs of meticulous care. John looked at the dirty combs, rusted scissors, and bowls of water with a foul stench. All signs of negligence, of neglecting responsibility. A dry laugh echoed from the reception desk. It was Cliff, one of the longtime staff members. His gaze toward John was anything but friendly, as if sizing him up as someone unworthy of attention. "Another newbie?" Cliff sneered, then turned to give orders to another staff member. John simply remained silent, lowered his head, and quietly followed Cliff's instructions. He didn't want to be discovered, didn't want to give away any suspicion. Every action he made had to be perfect, leaving no trace. But inside, a heavy feeling rose in his chest. The cold atmosphere, the indifference of the staff made him feel that everything he had built had been discarded. As he entered the work area, John saw Sylvia, a seasoned technician he had trusted greatly. Sylvia, with her skilled hands and caring demeanor, had always been an important part of the early years of the spa's operation. But now her movements seemed robotic, lacking the attention to detail, the finesse she once had. It seemed like she was exhausted with the work, tired of this environment, but couldn't do anything about it. Sylvia just brushed past John indifferently without saying a word. She must know something's wrong, but she's too scared to speak, John thought to himself. That feeling was like a shadow enveloping the space. A silent fear had taken hold of the people who once worked wholeheartedly for the spa. When a customer walked in, John's feeling became even clearer. This customer, a middle-aged woman, sat down with a slight look of anxiety. She received a wet towel, and the unmistakable stench of it made her wrinkle her nose. "This isn't clean," she softly said, but no one responded. Cliff from afar just glanced at her and turned away, indifferent. A heavy tension filled the room, eyes shifted toward the woman, and then just as quickly looked away as if it didn't matter. John could clearly sense the discomfort of the customer, but couldn't do anything. He stood there watching everything unfold, feeling like a failure. He had once built this place with all his trust and hope, but now it was in the hands of those who were irresponsible and disrespectful. He couldn't bear to watch anymore. A wave of anger rose in his heart, but he knew now wasn't the time. He had to remain silent, keep acting as an employee, and continue observing, documenting all the signs of decay. What happened to this place? How could it change so quickly? He wondered within himself. The answer seemed clear to him from the start. He couldn't just stand by and watch everything collapse. He had to do something, and he would find a way. Everything was clear now. It wasn't just a few careless staff members. It was a system that had rotted from the inside out, managed by people like Cliff. All the values the spa had represented were being wiped out day by day. But for now, John could only continue doing the work of an employee, continue to watch and wait. The next day, as John continued his work under the guise of an employee, the atmosphere in the spa seemed even more suffocating. The most noticeable change was in the staff's eyes. They no longer had the joy in their work, nor the passion they once had. Fake smiles, indifferent gestures, all were just facades hiding fatigue and frustration. John realized that something had changed, not just with the staff, but also with the customers, the very people John once saw as the reason for the spa's existence. John could no longer turn a blind eye. Every day he saw the clear signs of decline, tools that weren't properly sanitized, towels that smelled bad, and customers leaving with disappointed attitudes. In the past, his spa had been a place where each customer felt safe, as if they were being cared for by close friends. But now everything was different. One afternoon, as John was working near the reception desk, he saw Marjorie, a longtime customer of the spa, walk in. She had been a loyal customer since the early days, never missing an appointment. Her eyes scanned the staff, but no one greeted her with the friendly smile she had grown accustomed to. That was the first difference she noticed. But what hurt Marjorie the most was when she sat down and received a towel. The dampness, the foul odor rising from the towel made her frown. "This can't be," Marjorie whispered, her voice suddenly choking up. This was the towel she used to love, once fragrant with lavender, clean and fresh. But now it was just dirty, wet, and foul-smelling. She silently sat down, her eyes dimming, but she didn't say anything. She felt hurt not because of the towel, but because of the immense disappointment at seeing a place she trusted become something unrecognizable. John stood silently from afar, feeling Marjorie's pain like a slap in the face. He had once been proud of this spa, telling himself that it was a place that brought joy and relaxation to everyone. But now even his most loyal customer was beginning to feel the change. Each of her steps, each of her delicate gestures carried a silent disappointment, and John couldn't do anything to fix it. A feeling of helplessness welled up inside John. He could no longer ignore it. If this continued, the spa would be nothing more than a hollow shell. He had witnessed too much indifference, too much negligence from the staff and management. But what pained him the most was the silence of the seasoned employees like Sylvia, Edith, and Noel. They all knew something was wrong, but chose to stay silent, protecting themselves in an environment of fear. But John knew, no matter how bad things got, he couldn't just stand by. He had to act. John realized that this wasn't just the story of a few careless staff members. This was the story of a system that had been destroyed from the inside. Cliff, the person he once thought would be a loyal companion, had turned into a power-hungry figure, using fear and irresponsibility to run the place. All the values John had put into the spa, safety, customer care, employee loyalty, were slowly fading away. One morning, while John was still quietly working as an employee, he saw Noel, a new staff member, quietly step toward him. This young man had always been passionate and full of energy, but since Cliff had taken control, Noel seemed to have lost his spark. His eyes now held confusion and fear. "Don't do anything," Noel whispered, his voice lost in the noise of the busy space. "Anyone who stands up to Cliff gets fired instantly." John felt his chest tighten. Noel's fear felt like a dark wave sweeping over him. Everyone in the spa was living in fear and silence, but no one dared stand up to Cliff. Even Sylvia, who should have been the guardian of the spa's values, kept quiet. She avoided John's gaze, avoiding speaking the truth, but that only strengthened John's resolve. He couldn't let innocent people like Noel, Sylvia, and Edith continue to live in this atmosphere of fear. He had to do something. He had to restore respect, fairness, and most importantly, the safety the spa had once represented. Everything had become so clear. It wasn't just a few bad employees. It was a rotten system run by people like Cliff. All the values that John's spa once stood for were being wiped out day by day. But for now, John could only continue playing the part of an employee, continue watching and waiting. That day, as the morning light filtered into the spa, John could feel that everything around him was gradually changing. Not just the atmosphere, but the mood of each person. Employees like Sylvia, Edith, and Noel, those who had been with the spa for a long time, were no longer just lost in silence. Although they still kept a calm exterior, they couldn't hide the unease in their eyes. They knew there was no turning back. John continued to work under the guise of an employee, his eyes never leaving the details of the space. Every corner of the spa, every tool, every towel seemed like irremovable stains. He had built this place from the very beginning with love, trust, and dedication. Now all of those values seemed to have been buried under the dust of indifference and neglect. But today, John felt a new breeze blowing through. He was no longer just a bystander. He was someone truly ready to face the truth, no matter how painful it was. At lunchtime, when the spa was less busy, John decided to go to the back area, where all the neglect had been hidden. The musty smell began to spread from the old towels, from the tools that hadn't been cleaned properly. The scene before him made him stop, take a deep breath. This was the moment he couldn't deny. Everything he had built, everything he had been proud of, was now falling apart right before his eyes. The sight in the back room truly made his heart ache. Wet towels were thrown around, not washed properly. Scissors, razors, combs, all left dirty, with no signs of proper cleaning. The entire space was a combination of foul smells, humidity, and neglect. Things John couldn't have imagined. He tried to breathe evenly, but the truth overwhelmed him. He knew everything was completely off track, but John couldn't let failure bury everything. He looked at the dirty tools, the stains on the towels, the marks that couldn't be erased. Each of those marks was a warning, an accusation of the irresponsibility that Cliff and others had brought to this spa. But in that still moment, someone walked in. It was Sylvia. Her eyes looked sad, but still filled with resilience. She didn't say anything, just stood quietly next to John, as if she knew exactly what he was facing. She had never seen John so stunned, but she understood. Once the truth had been seen, it couldn't be ignored. "We have to do something, John?" Sylvia asked, her voice soft, like a question she hadn't dared to ask for a long time. Though simple, this question carried all the pain, loss, and fragile hope. John turned to look at her, his eyes full of determination. "We won't allow this to continue. Everything we've built cannot be destroyed by indifference and neglect. I've been silent too long. It's time to face the truth and take back what we've lost." Sylvia nodded, her eyes bright with understanding, but also with sympathy for this decision. She knew this would not be easy, but they couldn't ignore it anymore. Because if they kept silent like this, the spa would never be the place she had once loved. At that moment, Noel's eyes appeared from the corner of the door. He stood there, hesitating, as if wanting to step forward but not daring to. But John and Sylvia's silence wasn't acceptance. It was an invitation. "You see it too, don't you, Noel?" John turned to look at him, gently but persuasively. Noel hesitated, then walked in, his eyes no longer filled with innocence. I see it. I don't want to stay here anymore. But I'm scared. Scared I'll be fired. Scared everything will get worse." "You're not alone," John replied, his voice soft but firm. "We can't let fear hold us back. It's time for us to stand up, protect the values we've built together. If we don't do this, we'll only continue being victims of our own work." These words were like a burst of light, pushing away some of the darkness that had enveloped the place. Noel didn't say anything else, but his eyes had changed. He was no longer scared. Instead, a quiet resolve had taken over, ready to face the truth. John turned back to look at the back area one last time. He knew that today everything had to change. It was time for everything to be laid bare in the light, no matter how painful that process would be. But those pains would be the stepping stones to bring the spa back to its original values. John was ready. That day, the atmosphere in the spa became stifling, like a storm was about to strike, bringing unavoidable changes. Everything in this space had shifted. No longer the warm mornings with soft light shining on neatly folded towels, nor the peaceful silence of before. Now the spa resembled a battlefield, where people had to choose between standing for the truth or continuing to live in concealment. John was no longer an outsider. He stepped in, not as the powerful owner of the spa, but as a teammate, fighting alongside his staff. He had donned the employee uniform, a disguise that helped him blend into this space, allowing him to observe and experience everything firsthand. Although his eyes shone with determination, his heart was filled with an indescribable sense of worry. From the moment the spa doors opened in the morning, John immediately felt the change. Customers came and went, but the silence still hung in the air. The greetings from the staff were no longer warm. Instead, they were awkward. Everyone seemed to be afraid. No one dared to speak up when they saw Cliff, the one who had truly taken control of the spa, still running things his way. Every action Cliff made was full of arrogance, defiance, and a quiet threat that no one dared to challenge. Cliff always appeared cold and arrogant. He not only disrespected customers, but also mistreated the staff, treating them as mere tools to serve his own interests without any regard for their dignity or respect. Every time John saw him, anger welled up in his chest. While Cliff sat at the reception desk, directing what he considered important tasks, John noticed something strange. Sylvia, Edith, and Noel, the longtime employees, were no longer behind the counter with warm smiles, but instead wore expressions of deep concern. They had endured enough. The months of watching their company fall apart, the constant customer complaints, and the growing tension had all weighed heavily on their hearts. But now they no longer had to face these shocks alone. The tension in the air grew stronger by the minute. The whispers of the customers around them grew louder. John heard some of them begin to murmur about the declining quality of the service, about the tools not being properly cleaned, about the damp, musty towels they had to use when coming to the spa. This only made him more determined. After finishing a few small tasks, John stood up and made his way to the back room, where everything was falling apart. He needed to confront the situation head-on, and he couldn't let this continue. Every step he took was heavy, but the moment he entered the back room, the sight before him made him unable to turn a blind eye. Dirty towels were thrown around, cutting tools and razors hadn't been sanitized, and the air was filled with the stench of neglect. Is this what we've built? John thought to himself, his heart aching. All his efforts seemed to have been wiped out by carelessness and disrespect. Every small detail, the dirty towels, the unsanitized tools, all pointed to the decline of the spa. In that moment, a small sound came from behind. Sylvia, with sad eyes, had entered the room. She didn't speak, just stood quietly beside John, as if she knew exactly what he was facing. She had never seen John so stunned, but she also understood that once the truth was seen, there was no turning back. "We can't let this continue," John said, his voice firm. Sylvia nodded, her eyes brightening as if she had found a spark of hope. She realized that this change couldn't wait any longer. If they kept silent, the spa would never return to the place they once loved. Not only Sylvia, but Edith and Noel also felt the same. Each of them knew that silence and endurance would only make them accomplices in the downfall. And John, the founder of this spa, had now decided that he couldn't just stand by and watch his empire crumble. John turned back to look at Sylvia and Noel. They didn't need to say much. What they had seen, what they had witnessed, had been enough to make them realize that it was time to stand up, to protect the values they had built together. If they didn't do this, everything would be lost. So the battle was no longer just one person's fight. It was the battle of everyone who had placed their trust in this spa to restore honor, respect, and a safe, clean, working environment. The battle for truth had begun. The light in the spa was no longer warm like before. Instead, it felt cold, threatening, as if the space had been trapped in the silence of fear. John could clearly feel the tension in the air, with each breath from the staff being held back, while every step he took seemed to stretch out endlessly, heavy with purpose. Everything around him seemed to be sinking into oblivion, hidden under the facade of false dignity that Cliff and his supporters had built. But now everything was different. The whispers of doubt had turned into voices of truth. John was no longer an outsider. He was no longer the one who listened to complaints through a phone screen late at night. He was no longer the one who only focused on business development. Now he was someone who had to face the painful truth hidden inside the empire he had created. "We can't go on like this," John told himself, his eyes cutting through the people in the space. Every step he took now carried with it an unshakable determination. He didn't just want to restore the original values. He had to fight to keep the trust of the customers, the respect of the staff, and most importantly, his own honor. John had made up his mind to act, and action no longer meant just conversations or empty promises. He needed to reveal the truth, to make everyone see the reality behind the lies, the irresponsibility. John walked into the back room, where all the rot had been hidden. There was no sound. No one waiting to assist him. Everything was so silent it was almost unbearable. He looked around, and every little detail revealed the truth he had been trying to avoid. The musty towels, the unsanitized tools, and the stench of neglect started to fill the air. At that moment, Cliff entered, his eyes filled with scorn. Everything was still the same, even worse, with no change in attitude. "Get to work," Cliff said, his voice dripping with arrogance, completely indifferent. He hadn't yet realized that a battle was quietly brewing in the hearts of the staff and within John himself. The situation grew even more tense when another customer, an older man, entered and sat down. He carefully examined the tray of tools, then looked at John with a worried expression. "Is this safe?" he asked, his voice husky, full of doubt from years of experience. Cliff responded with a dismissive laugh, brushing it off. "Don't worry, you're old. But you're still afraid of this?" Once again, his lack of respect was glaring. The customer didn't respond, just sat back with a disappointed expression. This scene caused John's heart to break. He had once created this place with so much effort, so much hope, but now it was slowly being destroyed by those who didn't care. As the founder, he couldn't just stand by. He couldn't let what he had built be reduced to a stain in society, where lies and the negligence of a few people had pushed everything into the pit of failure. The change started right here, and no one could stop it. The suffocating feeling filled the room. Each step John took felt heavy, not just as a manager, but like a warrior preparing to face a battle with no mercy. Though he tried to keep a calm exterior, inside, waves of anger and disappointment were crashing, unstoppable. John stood there in the quiet spa where everyone watched his every move. Every glance from the staff was a reflection of their worry, anticipation, and fear. They were no longer the enthusiastic workers who once believed in the light of hope. Now they were overshadowed by fear and despair. But now John had gathered enough courage. He could no longer stay silent. He couldn't let everything continue like this. He couldn't let irresponsible people continue to destroy what he had worked so hard to build. He took a deep breath, as if trying to push away the exhaustion weighing on his heart. "That's enough," John said, his voice loud and strong, cutting through the silence. He didn't need to shout. He didn't need to prove himself with loud words. Just that one sentence was enough to make everyone in the room stop in their tracks. Those words weren't just a declaration, but a promise that he would no longer accept negligence, indifference, or carelessness. His eyes locked with Cliff's. He was the only one in the room who dared to face John in defiance. But now Cliff's eyes no longer held that self-assurance. The scorn in his gaze was slowly fading, replaced by worry and panic. "Cliff, you're not just an employee here. You're the one who's truly in charge of what's going on. But you don't deserve that position anymore. What you've done isn't serving the customers. It's betraying the trust we built." "I won't let that continue," John said, his voice firm, as if delivering a judgment. Cliff froze, his face turning red, his eyes looking at John as if he wanted to protest, but couldn't find the words. Everyone around them began to look on with a mixture of curiosity and caution, as those who had once feared Cliff now began to see the truth. John's words weren't just an accusation. They were a call for change. Without hesitation, John continued, no longer holding back. "The other staff, I don't blame them, but they've let fear take over. Those who once stood by me are now hiding in silence, too scared to speak. But that silence will no longer last. They need to know that I will stand up for them, for the values I've created." The eyes of Edith, Sylvia, and the other staff members turned to John with gratitude. They saw the courage in his eyes, and in that moment, they felt a glimmer of hope. Their silence was no longer a form of compromise. Now they could finally speak out. They could voice their own struggles, and they could stand up for what John had built. John turned back to face Cliff, walking with confidence, each step carrying with it the weight of the fear that had plagued him for so long. He continued, "This is the moment you need to leave, Cliff. No one can change what's happened, but you can change your future, and I don't want to see you here anymore. What you've done, what you've said, now it's all just betrayal." Cliff stood frozen, unable to speak. His arrogance was vanishing, and in that moment, he knew he no longer had any power here. John had made his decision, and it was a decision that couldn't be undone. Everyone in the room stood still, like they were witnessing a great battle, a battle they had never imagined would come. But now John had made one thing clear: honesty, respect, and dedication could never be broken by those who only sought personal gain. And from that moment, a major turning point in this story had begun. The silence in the spa was no longer the comfortable stillness it once was. It was a tense silence, charged with anticipation, as if a storm had just passed, leaving in its wake inevitable changes. Every breath from those present seemed heavy, as if they were waiting for a sign, for the next decision to come from John, who had just spoken like a judge, a savior, and also a leader guiding them back to the right path. Cliff, who had once considered himself the pillar of all decisions, was now just a shadow of himself. He stood there, arms hanging limply, his eyes darkened, no longer filled with the defiance he once carried. His arrogance had now become a fragile, easily broken shell. Every word and action he had made before now held no power, as the truth had been revealed. And John, the true leader, had stepped out of the shadows. John no longer looked at Cliff. He felt the change in the air, a new breeze filling the room. The people who had lived in fear before now began to sense the freedom and fairness sweeping in. Especially Sylvia and Edith, the two women who had long endured the cold, indifferent glances of those in power, now saw the light at the end of a long, dark tunnel. "We will start again, from scratch," John said, his eyes never leaving the loyal staff. "And this time, no one will be left behind. Each of you deserves to be treated better, to be respected properly." It wasn't just empty words. That declaration carried weight. People began to look at each other differently, their gazes filled with trust. Sylvia and Edith exchanged looks of encouragement, as if they too were feeling the strength of those words. John looked back at Cliff one last time. He didn't need to say anything more. That glance said everything. Cliff knew he no longer had a place here. All the good he had once built now lay tainted by his own negligence, arrogance, and irresponsibility. John didn't feel satisfaction seeing Cliff like this, but he understood it was necessary. Only through this could justice be served, and John would be the one to guide everything back on track. Cliff finally turned and walked away, silently without a word. His hands hung limp at his sides, no longer holding any power to maintain his dominance. In that moment, the staff's gaze seemed to confirm something very clear. This was the time for change. John stood there in the middle of the space that was once filled with laughter and joy, but now had only silence in its place. This silence wasn't to hide anything, but to listen, to feel the transformation taking place. John wasn't just leading, he was restoring the values that had been forgotten. "We will not give up," John said, his voice resolute. "We will start over, step by step, from every action, every detail. We will rebuild from what we lost, from the trust of the customers, from the respect we give each other. We won't let anyone leave because they feel forgotten or hurt." Those words from John were a promise, not only to himself but to everyone in the room. They all heard the sincerity, the unwavering commitment in his voice. They felt the change not just in his words but in his actions. He was no longer just the owner of the spa. He was the true leader, the one who made the right decisions no matter the cost. At that moment, the staff began to react in unmistakable ways. The nods from Edith, Sylvia, Noel, and the others were signs that they understood. They saw that John was not a figure above them, but someone who stood alongside them. And although no one spoke, they all knew that from that moment on, everything would be different. No one remained still anymore. Everyone began to move, to work as a true team. No longer were there fearful glances or silence. There was unity, there was solidarity. Step by step, change began to spread. And while they knew there would still be many challenges ahead, they all believed that under John's leadership, they could overcome anything. Thus the storm passed, leaving behind a new wave, a new beginning full of promise. What had been lost would now be rebuilt, from trust, from respect, and from the very people who had always been loyal. The atmosphere in the spa now felt entirely different. No longer was there the heaviness of silence or the lingering fear that had once filled the air. Instead, there was an open, fresh atmosphere, as though the entire space had been liberated from the stains of indifference and neglect. Everyone present felt the shift. A new beginning, not just for the work, but for the trust that had been lost. John stood, looking around the room, not with the eyes of the owner, but with the eyes of a friend, a leader who had once been a part of these people's lives. He could feel the change, however small, but it was enough to create a solid foundation for the next steps. It wasn't just about the business, it was about the lives of everyone here, all given a new chance. John didn't rush, he didn't need to speak too much. He understood that at this moment, actions were the most powerful words. Every gesture, every action he made now displayed the unshakable resolve and belief he had in what they were building. He smiled at his staff, sensing the solidarity and hope that was slowly blooming in their hearts. Edith, who had devoted 15 years to the spa, now stood near John. Her hair had grayed over the years, but the light in her eyes had become strangely bright, as though the vitality had returned to her body. "I think we can do this," Edith said, her voice thick with emotion, yet full of confidence. "I never thought I'd see this day. We've lost so much, but now I see hope." Sylvia stood beside her eyes wet, but this time not with sorrow or regret. There was a sense of renewal, like a breeze after a long, hot summer, filling her soul with energy. "We'll start over together," she said, her hands now more steady than ever before. "We don't have to be afraid anymore." Noel, the young man who had once lived in the shadows, now stood with eyes full of determination and strength. He no longer felt fear when facing Cliff or anyone else. "I believe in us," he said, gripping Edith and Sylvia's hands. "We can change everything. This is our chance." The atmosphere in the spa slowly transformed. Customers returned, and the apprehension that had lingered before was gone. As they sat down in the chairs, received clean towels, and sensed the safe, warm environment, they couldn't help but feel relieved, as though they had found the warmth that had been lost for so long. Marjorie, a loyal customer who had once left due to disappointment, came back. She walked in, no longer hesitant, but with confident steps. Her eyes lit up when she saw the clear transformation around her. "This place is like it used to be," she whispered, sensing the familiar feeling returning. "It feels like coming home." John stood from a distance observing everything. His heart swelled with a pride he couldn't quite put into words. He had fulfilled part of the promise he had made. But he knew this journey was only just beginning. There was still much to be done, many challenges ahead, but at least now, he had created a solid foundation to continue building on. He looked at his staff, the ones who had stood by him through the hardest times. John knew they weren't just employees. They were his true teammates, and it was they, not anyone else, who would help him rebuild this empire, starting from the trust that had been lost, from the mistakes that had been made. And then John's words echoed once more, but this time they were soft, filled with inspiration and certainty. "We won't just rebuild," he said, his eyes shining. "We'll do it better. We'll create a space where every customer feels safe, feels respected, and most importantly, feels like they are part of this family." This story isn't just about the revival of a spa. It's about the revival of trust, of self-respect, and the values that had been forgotten. And in that moment, everyone in the room knew they were standing at the beginning of a new journey, a journey that no one could stop. Because true change doesn't come from changing the place. It comes from changing the people inside it. The next day, the atmosphere in the spa had completely shifted. Everything seemed to have returned to its proper rhythm. The staff, though still a little apprehensive, had begun to realize the real change. The customers also seemed more at ease when they entered the space. Each fresh towel, each properly sanitized tool, and the sincere smiles of the staff gave them a sense of reassurance. But behind this external change, John could not stop thinking about what had happened. And the most important thing, he knew he could never go back. John sat alone in his small office, where he had often worked. He looked into the mirror in front of him, the lines on his face more pronounced than ever, showing the signs of sleepless nights and heavy thoughts. However, in his eyes, there was something different. It wasn't just exhaustion, it was resolve. Everything had gone according to plan, but what he was about to face wouldn't be easy. Cliff, the man who had trampled over all the values he had built, was still part of the team, and that was a truth he couldn't simply ignore. But John knew that the time had come to confront him, and not just him, but everything Cliff had done to this place. And then, when the doorbell rang, John knew that this moment had arrived. Cliff walked in, but this time, there was no arrogance in his steps, no mocking glances or self-satisfied smiles. He entered with a distracted look, his eyes no longer holding the confidence they once had, only confusion. It was as if all the pride he once had was now reduced to fragments. John stood up, not hurriedly, but with steady steps, meeting Cliff's eyes. He could feel the coldness in the air, the tension between them. But John knew this was the moment when everything had to be clarified. "Cliff," John said, his voice firm but calm, "what do you think of what has happened?" The question wasn't a challenge. It was a statement that, finally, the truth would come to light. Cliff stood frozen, not responding immediately. He simply stood there, unable to look John in the eye. In the silence between them, John didn't feel satisfaction. What he felt was disappointment and guilt from a man who once seemed invincible, now clearly showing signs of defeat. And then finally Cliff spoke, his voice weak, almost unable to get the words out. I didn't have any other choice. Pressure, money, everything weighed down on me. These weren't apologies, these were excuses. John listened to these words, but his heart no longer felt pity. He looked at Cliff, trying not to let his disappointment show on his face. Pressure can't be an excuse to destroy the values we've built. We are here to take care of our customers, Cliff. Nothing is more important than their safety and trust. John's voice didn't tremble, even though deep inside, he felt heartbroken by what had happened. He couldn't overlook these mistakes, and he couldn't allow Cliff to continue causing harm to this spa. But then, what surprised John was the change in Cliff's attitude. After a long silence, Cliff's eyes began to shift. No longer filled with arrogance, no longer full of disdain. He lowered his head, his voice cracking as he spoke. "You're right, I was wrong. I can't justify myself anymore. I've ruined everything, and I can't stay here if it means destroying all that you've built." John heard those words not with satisfaction, but with understanding. This wasn't the time to condemn, it was the time to create a chance for change. John looked directly at Cliff, his gaze resolute. "What matters is that you recognize that. Don't let excuses cloud your vision anymore. Freedom comes from facing the truth, not hiding from it. And today I'm not going to fire you, but you will have to start over. You'll learn everything again, step by step, from the beginning." These words weren't an act of forgiveness. They were a fair warning. John didn't want to destroy Cliff as a person, but he wanted to give him a chance to change, if he truly could. Cliff stood still, saying nothing more. He understood that this wasn't a confrontation. It was a final opportunity for redemption. And for John, it wasn't about revenge. It was about restoring justice for everyone who worked in this spa. In this way, John didn't just restore the spa, he also recreated the trust of everyone, from the staff to the customers. Everything had changed and it would never be the same again. Everything in the spa seemed to be returning to a new rhythm. But a light anxiety still hung in the air. The fresh feeling after the confrontation with Cliff still carried tension, unable to fully erase the old scars. People had changed, but would it be enough to erase the damage that Cliff had caused? John stood by the window looking out, feeling like everything in his life was shifting in a direction that could never go back. He couldn't simply continue being the owner of a business. He was now the protector of the trust of thousands of customers, and now he had to lead the revival, not just of the spa, but of himself. The next day, when John walked into the spa, a completely new atmosphere enveloped the place. The staff was working with a different energy, no longer hesitant or anxious, but with a quiet confidence radiating from their small actions. Customers, despite still murmuring about the past, felt at ease when they sat down in the chairs, received soft, clean towels, and sensed the air of safety and cleanliness. They couldn't help but feel a sense of relief, as if they had found the warmth that had been lost for so long. Suddenly, a familiar voice called out from behind. It was Sylvia. She stood quietly in the corner, her face wearing a slight smile, not the fearful expression from before, nor the eyes that avoided others. "John," she said, "I think we can do it." John turned around, meeting her gaze with deep gratitude. "Thank you, Sylvia. You're the one who kept the spark alive in this spa all these years. Now we'll start over, step by step." Sylvia's story was proof of everything John had fought for. She wasn't just one of the most loyal employees. She was part of the spa family. Though she had faced difficult decisions, Sylvia had always upheld respect in the highest standards. And now, as John decided to begin again, she was the first to stand by him, supporting him on this journey. But John's work had never been about just fixing tools or cleaning dirty chairs. He had to think about how to regain the trust of all the customers who had been betrayed. He had to face everything that had happened in the past and make those customers who had left, those who had lost faith in his spa, come back. And he did just that. The calls, the meetings, the sincere apologies to each individual. Each promise, each conversation was a rebirth of trust. As for the staff, John didn't just teach them about work standards, he taught them about respect. Respect for each other, for the customers, and most importantly, for themselves. The first day John stepped out of his office to work alongside the staff, a different feeling filled the entire spa. The towels were neatly folded, no longer wrinkled or damp. The tools were thoroughly sanitized, with no trace of neglect or carelessness. The staff worked with a renewed energy, paying attention to every detail. "We're not just a spa," John said as he looked at each of his employees. "We are a place where people find peace, not just service, but reassurance." And then a miracle happened. A week later, one of the spa's former customers came back. She was one of the customers who had complained about the wet towels and poor service before. But today she walked in with a different look in her eyes, as if searching for change. "Hello, John," she said, her smile gentle. "I've heard so many good things about this place recently, and I wanted to try again." John stood up, welcoming her warmly. "We'll do better than last time, Mrs. Marjorie. I promise you'll have the best experience today." As she sat down, receiving a warm towel and being cared for attentively, John looked at her, feeling his heart beat faster. This wasn't just the return of a customer. This was the return of trust. And that trust was what had helped him overcome every obstacle. In that moment, John understood that change wasn't easy. But when you face the truth, when you start over, you don't just restore a business. You restore your belief in yourself and in the hearts of the people around you. And for John, this was just the beginning of a new journey, a journey he would never abandon. All he had learned wasn't from the failures or disappointments, but from the people around him, the loyal staff and the beloved customers. And now together, they were walking forward hand in hand toward a bright future, not only for the spa, but for themselves. Every morning when the first light shone through the windows of the spa, John felt as if he were living in a dream. Everything felt new. No longer did he carry the weight of guilt, nor the shock from the dark days. Instead, the air was filled with hope, vitality, and a powerful transformation. He was no longer just the head of a business. Now he was the leader of a community, a family. Looking around, he saw that his staff was also changing. Sylvia, Edith, and even the newer employees were working with an enthusiasm they had never shown before. They weren't just serving customers. They were taking care of every detail with love for the job, with a belief in the good they were rebuilding. Every customer who walked in, whether new or old, could sense the difference. What made John most proud was not just the change in the work itself, but in the attitude of the people. What he had once taught about respect, safety, and trust was no longer just an empty promise. Those values were now being put into practice every single day. He no longer had to secretly watch the staff. No longer did he hear complaints or sad stories about disappointments. Instead, there were laughs, warm greetings, and thoughtful gestures. Still, John knew the journey wasn't over. Everything could change quickly, and he couldn't allow himself to become complacent. He needed to continue upholding what had been built, maintaining the trust of the customers, the dedication of the staff, and never forgetting why he had started this journey in the first place. That day, as usual, John walked into his office, where the old desk still sat, but now covered with a clean cloth. He sat down, opened his computer, and began reviewing the feedback from customers. Just as he expected, not all customers had returned. There were still some complaints, and some hadn't been able to forget what had happened. But the positive feedback, the praise, and the returning smiles from loyal customers had started to outweigh the negative comments. One morning, while John was working, an old customer, who had left due to dissatisfaction, unexpectedly walked in. She was one of those who had once complained about the wet towels and subpar service. But today she entered with a different look in her eyes, one that sought change. "Hello, Mr. John," she said, her smile gentle. "I've heard so many good things about this place lately, and I wanted to try it again." John stood up, welcoming her with warmth. "We will do better than last time, Mrs. Marjorie. I promise you'll have the best experience today." As she sat down, received a warm towel, and was carefully attended to, John looked at her, feeling his heart race. This wasn't just the return of a customer. This was the return of trust. And that trust was what had helped him overcome all the challenges. At that moment, John understood that change wasn't easy. But when you face the truth, when you start over, you not only revive a business, you revive your belief in yourself and in the hearts of those around you. And for John, this was just the beginning of a new journey, one he would never give up on. Everything he had learned wasn't from the failures or disappointments, but from the people around him, the dedicated staff and the loyal customers. And now, they were all walking forward, hand in hand, toward a bright future, not only for the spa, but for themselves. Thank you for following this story with us. If you found this video inspiring or it helped you see life in a new light, don't forget to leave a like and share your thoughts in the comments below. We'd love to hear your feedback. And if you haven't subscribed to the channel yet, be sure to hit subscribe so you don't miss any exciting and meaningful videos in the future. Thank you again, and we'll see you in the next videos. Wishing you strength and confidence on your journey.